Welcome back, it's me, Lou. For today's video, we're going to take a look at something a little bit different, something a little bit more special. So, I'm a big fan of the Major Wrestling Figure Podcast. And for those of you who don't know, it's a podcast about wrestling action figures. And it's hosted by Matt Cardona on the right, Brian Myers on the left, and also Smart Mark Sterling. Some of you might recognize Matt Cardona as he was formerly known as Zack Ryder in the WWE, and Brian Myers was formerly known as Kurt Hawkins in the WWE. So maybe I want to say it was almost 3 years ago when the podcast first started. I knew it. I heard about it when it started, but I didn't jump on it right away. The funny thing was that I was never really a big fan of Matt Cardona in WWE when he was known as Zack Ryder. I liked him, but it's not like I was a fan or anything like that. If anything, I think I might have been a bigger fan of Kurt Hawkins at the time. The only reason why I kind of got into the Major Wrestling Figure podcast was because I was actually a big fan of Matt Cardona's fiancée, Chelsea Green, who's also a professional wrestler. And Chelsea, she used to come through Chicago a lot, wrestling the indie circuit. We saw her wrestle, I think, a couple of times at Zello Pro Wrestling. We've seen her at, I think, Shimmer. There was a Rise and Impact show that we saw her at. So, I mean, she was in town so often that every time we went to an independent wrestling show, especially a female wrestling independent show, we saw her so often, I kind of became a fan of hers. And I was listening to, I think it was X-Pac's podcast, and I think later on maybe Lillian Garcia's podcast, but we'll talk about that later. But I was listening to X-Pac's podcast, and I think Chelsea was a guest on there, and that was the reason why I was listening to it to begin with. And then I think she was talking about how she was talking about some of her wrestling and Impact, and some of her, I think she did some work as like a stunt lady or stunt person. Sorry about that. She did some stunt work, and I think during the podcast she mentioned how she was dating Zack Ryder, aka Matt Cardona, and then I think she might have mentioned also that how he had a action figure podcast. And then not too long later, I was listening to Lillian Garcia's podcast, and Cardona was talking about his action figure podcast. He was plugging it on the show. And then I was like, you know what? I keep on hearing about this action figure podcast, and I'm a pretty serious action figure collector. And I'm like, I'm just going to give it a listen. Because I always knew that he was into action figures, but I never really knew how deep he was into it or how hardcore. So I gave the first episode a listen, and I instantly fell in love with it. Hearing his stories of when him and Brian Myers used to hunt for toys back when they were in developmental kind of reminded me a lot of the toy hunting days I'd go on with me and my buddies. So the podcast immediately won me over, which I thought was kind of funny. Because like I said, I was never a fan of Cardona's to begin with. It was more so me being a fan of Chelsea's that got me introduced into his world of action figure collecting. Because Chelsea is a great wrestler. Nothing, not to take anything away from Matt Cardona, who's great also, but I don't know. I mean, Chelsea won me over. She has great in-ring work, and she has a lot of presence and personality, and I don't know. She just really has a lot of I don't know. She kind of has that X factor. The minute she's on TV or in the ring, she has a certain presence about her, and Cardona too. And I don't know. I mean, just listening to his podcast, it's kind of weird because I'm a bigger fan of wrestlers in what they, not necessarily what they portray in the ring as their wrestling personas, but sometimes what wins me over and makes me a fan of theirs is actually more so like what they do in their personal life. And the fact that he's Cardona and Myers are like hardcore into action figures, for me that interests me a lot more than seeing them wrestle in the ring. Like, I'd rather listen to them just talk about action figures all day than watch some of their best matches. Nothing against them because they're great wrestlers, but for me, I can relate to being a toy collector. I can't really relate to being a professional athlete. So, but yeah, like Cardona, Myers, Mark Sterling, Chelsea, they're all all brilliant and great workers in the ring, but it's more so their personal lives that kind of interests me. So that's what kind of got me into this Major Wrestling Figure podcast. So in terms of the Major Wrestling Figure podcast, I kind of realized I have a kind of like a small, tiny micro collection of memorabilia, and I thought it'd just be a fun video to just share some of that. So let's start off with the fig pins first. All right, so this was maybe going on 3 years ago. I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago. The WWE was in town, and they were in Chicago, and I think they were in town for like three nights. There was a pay-per-view. They were here for NXT, and I think they might have been here for Raw or SmackDown. So it was kind of like a full weekend of this WWE activities going on in Chicago. And the Major Wrestling Figure podcast, they did a live podcast at one of the bars in the city. I can't remember which one. And my brother and I attended it, and it was kind of cool because we got some merchandise out of the thing. So anytime, real quick plug, anytime, the Major Wrestling Figure podcast holds a live event, if you have the opportunity, check it out. It's a really fun time. You get to see them in their natural habitat of just being, collectors, and you get to be around the community they've established, and it's a very fun, positive evening. Lots of laughs, lots of stories, lots of drinks. But if you're into the merchandise end too, there's lots of merchandise to be had at these events. And some of these, I can't remember if these were freebies for like attending the event, or because it's such a while back. But so when we went to their live podcast in the city, some of the bonuses we got was these fig pins, and these are enamel fig pins. At the time, fig pins were super hot. I don't know how hot fig pins are nowadays. I'll go to Walmart, and they have in their collector section, they sell fig pins of all sorts of crazy things, from anime characters like Dragon Ball and like My Hero Academia and Star Wars. So people are into fig pins, but I know they were super white hot a while ago. I'm not sure about now, but towards the height of fig pin collecting, they're putting out. I still think they might put out pins to this day. I don't really keep track with that kind of stuff. But when they did their live show in Chicago, they had these Chicago Bulls themed pins. Matt Cardona likes to tout himself as the Michael Jordan of wrestling action figure collectibles. So he's wearing the number 3. He's wearing the number 23 as Michael Jordan. And Brian Myers, he kind of touts himself as the Scottie Pippen. So he has Pippen's number, the 33 here. And Zombie Sailor, he put out these fig pins. And I don't know, everything about this is slick. The packaging is nice. It's printed on a nice glossy cardstock. And yeah, I mean, it's a cool little piece of memorabilia from the show. And when you look on the back, at the time, this is kind of like a checklist of all the fig pins they had at the time. So it's pretty neat. And then this is a special set right here, because at the show, I believe this was part of a raffle. So they printed out, I think, a limited number of these fig pins, but in the Bulls home jerseys, which is the white uniforms. And then here's my raffle ticket, and I guess I must have won the raffle because I have this in hand. But the cool thing with this is that this was limited, and on the back, here's kind of like the proof of authenticity. This is the major standard. This is a green tag, and the date of the event was November 23rd, 2019. So that's almost 2 years ago. And these were the chase figures for the Chicago show. Was Major Live 4 and the white jersey. And this is cool because I got number 1 out of 10. So there's 10 of these in existence, and this is number 1 of them. Or this is actually number 1. So this is one of those cool things. It's kind of ironic because I'm not really big into collecting fig pins, but the fact that I got this, I don't know, it kind of like for me makes that night a little bit more special. So yeah, we got that. And also at the show, we got this inflatable beach ball. In keeping with the Chicago Bulls theme, so it has the Major Wrestling Figure Podcast initials, but you blow up this beach ball and it just looks like a basketball, which is neat. And last year, not 2020, but not 2021. Oh no, I take it back. So this past year, during WrestleMania weekend of around April 2021, normally in the wrestling world, anytime there's a huge WrestleMania weekend, it seems like every company wrestling company in existence does something, in correlation with that WrestleMania weekend. Most of the time, a lot of these companies will travel to the host WrestleMania city and hold events of their own. But for the Major Wrestling Figure Podcast, I think since we're in the pandemic and lockdown or whatever, they kind of pre-taped their live show, and it was done out of Myers' wrestling school, the Creative Pro Wrestling School. And for that, if you ordered the pay-per-view, you got some memorabilia out of it. So my brother, he ordered the pay-per-view, and he got this in the mail not too long ago. But he doesn't really collect stuff, so he just gave it to me. And for that, we got Major Pod Network presents FWF Live. So this was a pin to commemorate the live event. And it's really cool. There's a nice graphic here, which I believe is done by TTD. And these pins were produced by Zombie Sailor Toys. Really beautiful artwork. I love TTD's graphic design sense too. He has a really strong sense of graphic design. I love the way his colors pop. He has good sense of composition and contrast. So I really think the Major Pod Network, they really nabbed themselves a keeper in terms of a graphic designer getting TTD, because TTD does really amazing work. And for the people that are big into collecting trading cards, they released this FWF commemorative card, which is cool. And it has all the participants of the event. You have like Smart Mark, Dreamer, Shane Douglas, VSK, amongst others, Joe Shoes. Now this FWF Live, this event really surprised me, because I thought it was going to be along the lines of Gallo is Talking Shop Mania. I thought it was going to be more like a comedy event, but it actually turned out to be like one of the better indie wrestling shows I saw that year. So yeah, mad props for them putting on a great show. And then one of the bonuses you got for ordering the pay-per-view, you got this Maven Micro Brawler, and this is limited edition. For those of you that remember Maven from back in the day, he debuted on Tough Enough when when it was on MTV. So yeah, this is pretty neat. I enjoyed Maven a lot when he wrestled back in the day. I was kind of disappointed when he was kind of done with wrestling, but I'm glad to see him, popping up every now and then for those Major Wrestling Figure Podcast live shows. But this is a cool thing. If you're into collecting the Micro Brawlers, which are put out by Pro Wrestling Tees, this is a really fun one. They're highly collectible, and the prices on the secondary market, God, they shoot up really fast. So yeah, you always need to grab these when they pop up, because the prices just skyrocket. So yeah, this is my small micro collection of Major Wrestling Figure Podcast stuff. Like I said, I thought it was a weird journey to become a fan of the podcast. I was initially a fan of Chelsea Green because she's a kick-ass wrestler. And then when I found out that she was dating Zack Ryder, that kind of surprised me. I'm like, oh, she's dating Ryder. And then I listened to, their first podcast, and it really won me over. Like I said, I can't relate to them being pro wrestlers, but when it comes to collecting like action figures or trading cards or other kind of memorabilia, I could really relate to that. The kind of weird addiction we have to like just collecting toys and all sorts of weird oddities that are associated with our passions. So yeah, this is one of the weird things that I have in my collection. I'd like to expand the collection even more. I know that they're branching off into doing their own toy line and stuff, so we'll see. But yeah, this is it. Just wanted to share it with you guys. So until the next video, I'll talk to you later. Take care.